Right, I'm going to spin the globe, and wherever my finger lands, that's what we're going to talk about today. Well, would you look at that? It's the Holy Lands. Hello, my lovelies. I'm Kelsey Niena. This is the Orange Lily Project, and today we're going to be talking about biblical interpretation, specifically by using geography. Geography tells stories. Even today, if we're ever giving directions, we generally don't say turn left on Main Street. If you're anything like people in Pittsburgh, you'll hear, oh, turn left where Bob's Burgers used to be. That's how we give directions, and it's how we understand the world around us. And for the people in biblical times, it was doubly so because so much of their identity was tied up in the land and where they grew up and where their families came from. And a quick side note about that, though, I know my great-grandmother's name and I knew she was an artist, but beyond that, I don't really know much about her. The same wasn't true for people in biblical times. Not only did they know what their great-grandparents did, they knew what your great-grandparents did and were still sore about it. Now, I didn't give you a whole lot of time to look at it, but hopefully you'll be able to see right here. The Holy Lands was in the Middle East, and it still is, but much of our old history in the Bible is taking place in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria, and bits of Iran. And then in the New Testament, the Greeks and the Romans show up. But so while the names have, of course, changed over the last 1,000 years, geographically, if you're trying to figure out what the world looked like then, think Middle Eastern times, which is why, sorry to tell you, Jesus wasn't white. Because so much of the Old Testament takes place in Africa and the Middle East, a simple rule of thumb is where there's water, that's where people are going to live, because they need water to drink. And where there's water, there are families and there are politics, which is why we're going to be looking at geography and politics together as one. While the original 3 covenants are really important, for the sake of our video, where we're using the land to help us interpret, we're only going to be starting with the Abrahamic covenant and Abram and his wife Sarai. So way back when, there's a man named Abram and his wife Sarai, and they're getting on in years and they're barren and they've got no hope of having their line continue. When they die, the family is dead. And that's one of the reasons God contacting him is so important. So Abraham was originally known as Abram, and he lived in ancient Mesopotamia area, way over here in a place called and the land of his fathers. And to give you an idea, over here is where the Persian Gulf is today. And so Abram grew up in a place where there were multiple gods, and that will come into play as well. And God reaches through time and space and says, Abram, pack up your things, take your wife, and follow me to the place where I will show you. And he forms a covenant with Abram, saying that even though they're barren and they are way too old to even have any hope of the 2 of them having a child to carry on the family line, God promises them through a covenant that he will number Abram's descendants, so many that they will outnumber the stars in the sky and the sands before him, and these people will be a light to all nations, and he will give them a land to inhabit here. And he follows him, and they wind up in Egypt for a while, but finally they enter Canaan and the land that will eventually be theirs. And their son, Isaac, is born in Beersheba. Now, a famous story of Abraham and Isaac is actually a very important story for the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, where God contacts Abraham and says to take Isaac, who's now an adult, and says to bind him and sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. And Abraham takes his son and binds him, and he's ready to do it, trusting in God's promise, which to him means he's going to raise Isaac from the dead. And we hear this story of God telling Abraham to kill his son, and we think this is a horrible thing. How could he possibly have done something like that? remember the culture around us during the time. Abraham lived in Ur, and his father would have worshipped multiple gods. And during this time, throughout the time of the Bible, child sacrifice, human sacrifice, bloodletting, these were all very common practices. Abram wouldn't have known any different. The concept of a God calling for the blood or the life of another would not have been a surprise. But when Abraham has bound Isaac and is ready to sacrifice his son, that is when God sends an angel to stop Abraham and says not to do it. And it's in this moment that we begin to really see just how different this God is from any of the other deities that are worshipped. Not only is he not requiring human or child sacrifices, but after Isaac is released, he provides a ram for the sacrifice instead. This is not a covenant, but it's already a foreshadowing of what's to come. God doesn't require human sacrifices from us. Even though, according to sin and justice, we definitely deserve it, he doesn't require that from us. Instead of Abraham's firstborn son, God is going to supply his firstborn son to be the replacement, the surrogate for all of us. So that's a fun little glimpse of what's to come and why that wouldn't have been such a strange thing for Abraham to be told to do that. Now, they're in Beersheba, roughly, and quick side note, we'll get more into this later, there's some discrepancy where Mount Moriah was. Some believe it's the hill in Jerusalem, and others believe it's in Samaria. Just tuck that away for later. So, Isaac's mother, Sarah, dies, and Abraham sends a messenger up to Haran and Padan Aram to see if there's a bride for Isaac. And already, I apologize for the mispronunciations. Oh well. They find Rebecca, they come down, they marry, they have twins. Esau and Jacob, and remember Jacob is the second born. Hijinks ensues, and Jacob steals Esau's birthright, and Esau is looking to kill. And so Rebecca sends her favorite son, Jacob, to save his life, sends him back to the land of her family to stay with her brother, Laban. And he's staying in Padan Aram and Haran. And while he's there, he meets and falls in love with his future wife, Rachel. And he is tricked into marrying Leah. And then he isn't really tricked, but he just kind of goes along with taking 2 more women, and his family flourishes. A quick side note about that, though. Oftentimes today, back then and today, we'll have someone reference a part in the Bible and say, oh, it happened in the Bible, therefore it's totally fine to do. And one of the examples is bigamy, or multiple marriages. Now, while it is true, many of these people took on multiple wives, and later on we're going to see somebody who had 300 wives and 700 concubines, which sounds like a lot of work, frankly. Where we do see that happen, it also is shown pretty plainly the damage that causes. So just because something is shown in the Bible does not mean it's being condoned. Instead, it can actually be showing why it's not really a great idea. So, side tangent done. So, Jacob, his 4 wives, his 12 sons, at least 1 daughter, Dinah, and maybe more daughters. They're wandering around, and Joseph is sold into slavery and taken to Egypt, and Egypt's over there for now. And a famine breaks out, and Jacob's sons go to Egypt for food, and holy cow, it's Joseph, and reunion, huzzah, and during the famine, Jacob and all of his family, all his children, great-grandchildren, etc., and so forth, go to live in Egypt to, wait the famine out. And they settle, they're fruitful, and multiply, multiply, multiply. And that's when we get to Exodus. Now, in Exodus, it opens up saying that there is a new Pharaoh who knows nothing of Joseph or the help he gave in ages past. He doesn't know about him, he doesn't care. All he knows is there's this people who are multiplying too much and they are enslaved. And like I said, where we often might not look back at our family history too far to put a lot of meaning into it, part of the Jewish identity is they were once slaves. And that's something they never really fully forget or get over. It's ingrained in their holidays, in their feasts, and we'll see that come into play throughout the stories we look at. So God sends Moses, and plagues happen, and they are released from Egypt. They go through the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, depending, and they're wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. No, they were not lost in that they didn't know what way they were going physically, but one of the things that is pretty common with Israel is even though God is constantly reaching through time and space to contact them and speak directly to them, we and they are a very forgetful people who often, anytime things get really rough and we don't get things our way immediately, we start looking for other sources. So they're in the wilderness for not very long, and they start worshiping other things other than God. And as punishment, they've got to wander around in the wilderness for a while thinking about what they did. And Mount Sinai, 10 Commandments, it's happening there. So while they're in the wilderness, the Mosaic covenant is formed, and they've got the 10 Commandments. And during the Mosaic covenant, God decrees, you will be my people, and I will be your God. Do not forget that I'm the one who liberated you. You once were slaves, now you are free, and you are being called to be a holy priesthood, a light to lighten all nations and draw them ever closer to me. These people are set apart, and they're meant to be different from every other nation. They once were slaves, now they are free, and they are free to worship the one true God. Now, so they're wandering in through the wilderness, and finally they go up past the Dead Sea. It's called the Dead Sea because it's so full of salt, nothing can grow there, fun fact. And they cross the Jordan River into Jericho. Another fun fact, Jericho is considered archaeologically to be the oldest city ever that they've been able to find. And you can still find the ruins to this day. So, fun fact, boom. So they get to Jericho, and next you've got the time of the judges, where every man did what was right in his own eyes, which translates to bad things were happening. And during that time, God used prophets to get his message across to the people. And I said before, it's important to know what the surrounding cultures were doing, because just as we start to behave and talk like and walk like and eat like and just behave like the people around us, the same is true for the environments we find ourselves in. And the people of Israel, even though they were called to be separate and different from every other culture, they saw the surrounding cultures and wanted to copy them. And so during the time of the prophets, specifically for Samuel, they contacted him, he was the priest of the Lord, and said, "We want a king, give us a king." And Samuel, there's a speech in 1 Samuel where he's saying, guys, if you want a king, these are the things he's going to do to you. He's going to turn you into slaves. You're going to be doing forced labor. He's going to raise the taxes. You're going to have to go to war for him, whether you like it or not. You once were slaves and now you're free. But if you take on a king, you're making yourselves slaves again in a different way. Don't do this. Don't displease the Lord like this. And the people say, we want a king and we want him now. We want to be like everybody else. And Samuel's like, what do you want me to do about this? And God says, okay, you want to be like everyone else? Then you will be like everyone else. Here's your king. His name is Saul. The crowning of Saul marks the beginning of Israel's time of kings. Now, covenantally, we are currently between the Mosaic covenant, and we're just a few decades away from the Davidic covenant. Now, Saul is made king kind of against his will, and he sets up camp in Gibeah, which is just slightly over here from Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is eventually going to be their capital and most sacred of towns. And just south, a couple miles, is Bethlehem, which we all know to be the birthplace of the vengeful and favorite King David. So eventually, Saul is killed and David becomes king. And we're going to be zooming in at some point to look at the rule of David and how his failure, well, he started off as a very, very holy boy and holy man, but as he kept going, he started behaving like every other king in a sense, and we are able to see the gradual destruction of the kingdom because of his failure as a husband, a father, and as a holy man. And we'll be looking at that later. But early on, when things are going well, God forms a covenant with him. It's the Davidic covenant saying that your line will never be broken, and I'm going to send a king through your line, through your seed. There will be a king who will be the Messiah, and he will put all things right. This is the Davidic king the Jews are waiting for today, and this is the Davidic king that we believe has been carried out through the birth, life, death, resurrection, and eventual return of Jesus. So one of the things about David is he wanted to build a temple for the Lord, and God said, hey, that's not for you to do. That's going to be a later thing. And many, many politics later, and fights and deaths, and lots of killed siblings and cousins, eventually David's son Solomon becomes king. And Solomon, he was credited with being the wisest man in the world in history. He was also pretty dang stupid. He builds the temple, and it's a beautiful thing, and we're going to be having a time where we'll look at the temple in depth much later on, but he builds the temple, and to form alliances with other people, he starts marrying women from other cultures, including the princess of Egypt. And he takes on 300 wives, 700 concubines, a lot of work. And because the temple was done and he needed something else to do apart from these 1,000 women, he starts to build temples for these women to worship their various gods. Now, this is problematic for a number of reasons. One, these gods are being brought into a land that is supposed to be holy and exclusively for the Lord. And so the culture is being further contaminated with heresy and other gods and their practices. And also, Solomon starts worshiping these gods. So he is no longer being, the example for the nation to worship just the one God. So he is falling away, and Israel is falling away. But one of the other things that happens, because Solomon is determined to build all these temples for his women's gods, he does forced labor on the people and raises the taxes astronomically so that they're forced to build these temples, which many of them are finding, an abomination to their faith, and he's taxing them dry. Until by the time Solomon is no longer king and his son Rehoboam becomes king, the people actually go to him and say, please do not be the same kind of king as your father, let up on the taxes. And Rehoboam, who's a very proud man, says, no, actually, I'm going to do it even harder, and raises the taxes more. And as a result, 10 of the 12 tribes of Jacob, all up here, split and leave him, leaving only the tribe of Judah and Bethlehem. And they say, you want the temple? It's yours. We want nothing to do with it. And so now we have, with the splitting of these kingdoms, we get the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the southern kingdom gets the temple and the palace in the divorce. And in the northern kingdom, they set up shop in Samaria. Now, Samaria is both a city and a general area. Think Indianapolis in Indiana, Samaria in Samaria. And we've got the northern kingdom with their line of kings and their line of prophets that the Lord is sending, saying, hey, you got to get yourself together here. Stop worshiping these other gods. Focus only on the one true God. And we've also got a line of kings in the southern kingdom and a line of prophets. Same story. You need to get yourself into shape. Stop worshiping other gods. Stop consorting with other cultures. You're ruining yourselves, and the other shoe's going to drop. Now, because this land has been split, the military has been split as well, and now they're not strong enough to defend themselves, and so they start having to form even more alliances. The southern kingdom creates, again, a much bigger alliance with Egypt, And remember, they took their family history very, very seriously. Much of their identity is they once had been enslaved by Egypt, and now they've become too weak to defend themselves without Egypt. Egypt eventually starts to intentionally take over. Now, meanwhile, in the northern kingdom, we get an attack from the north, from Assyria, who is known for, I think it was like skinning people alive and then trooping their slaves past the writhing bodies of the dead. Really nice people. And so Assyria starts coming down and taking over from up top. Now, in Assyria is a town called Nineveh, which, if you know anything about the prophets, you may remember a story about Jonah. And God says, go to Nineveh and tell them my reckoning is coming, but they've got a chance to repent. And Jonah says, are you kidding? Do you know what they've done to my people? And he doesn't want to go. These are the people he's thinking about. It's these people who famously took over his land and slaughtered his people, not completely, but you know, and were horrible people. And so he says, heck with that, I'm going the other way. And so God sends a whale or a big fish. Anyway, so those Assyrians. After Assyria starts doing stuff, the next monster or empire of the week rises up, the Babylonians. And they take over all of Assyria, including the Holy Lands that were, taken over. And Babylon does a couple things which were pretty common warfare tactics. One, they take some of the best and brightest of the land and take them to Babylon to become acclimated to their culture. It's so much easier to have a prisoner who calls their cage home. And so they take these people to Babylon to, get their knowledge, to educate them and assimilate them into their culture and leave kind of the dregs behind. But one of the things they also do is they burn down the temple, which is the heart of this culture. Even though they've been split, even though they've been at war, the Temple of Jerusalem is one of their gems, and they leave. They're being carted off as slaves and prisoners of war with the smoke of their temple behind them. Books of the Bible-wise, real quick, we've gone through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and these main prophets, and the prophets are continuing to talk to what's left of the northern and southern kingdom, but also a bit to the people in exile. And while they're in Babylon and eventually Persia, while they're in Babylon, we've got Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But then what should happen? The next monster empire of the week arrives, and Persia starts taking over everything, including Babylon, Assyria, the Holy Lands, etc., and so forth. And it's during the time of the Persians that we've got the story of Esther, who was a Jewish woman who had been born and raised in Babylon and became a queen. During this time, there is a man named Nehemiah who is a Jew, but he's grown up in exile, and he finds favor with the king, and he's writing letters back to home, and he's finding out that the temple is still in ruins, and he finds favor and permission to come back and try and rebuild the temple. And this is going to be known as the Second Temple period. There was the first temple and then the Second Temple. And the Second Temple was from, let me quick check, I think it was 516. Well, how about that? The second period era was 516 BC until 70 AD. So Nehemiah is allowed to go back home to his land of origin, several generations down the road, but it's precious to them. They remember their homelands and they ache for it. And they were in exile. They worked very, very hard to keep their faith. And one of the things that happened while they were in exile is they wrote down their scriptures. And they come here and they see the people who have remained, who have acclimated to the culture that Babylon and then the Persians left behind, and these Jews who have done everything they can to keep their faith and stay, separate from other people, come here to find their relatives and other Jews who have assimilated to the surrounding cultures, who have taken up additional gods, who they still claim to worship the one true God, but then they've got a bunch of other little mini gods. And this is not the best example, but picture a thoroughbred poodle who then comes in contact with a mutt. And this mutt is saying, I'm a purebred just like you. No, you're not, little pipsqueak, go away. And so as Nehemiah and the thoroughbred Jews, let's say, start rebuilding the temple, the kingdom of the north, especially the Jews from Samaria, from the Samaritan region, they come down and offer to help rebuild the temple, and the Jews say no and send them away and tell them not only can they not help with the temple, but they're not allowed to worship there at all. Who defeats the Persians? The Greeks with Alexander the Great. And somewhere around the Greek time, there is rebellion with the Maccabees, and they have about 100 years of unoccupied Israel. And then the Romans come in. So once again, part of their culture and their identity is they were slaves in Egypt. They had their own place. They lost it by giving it up and squabbling amongst each other and rejecting their God. And now they were captives in a strange land, and now they're home, but it's not owned by them anymore. Imagine if you had a home that had belonged to your great-great-great-grandparents all the way down the line, and then someone took over your house and said, well, you can stay if you pay your rent. This isn't right. And it's so thoroughly ingrained in their identity that they're waiting and waiting for this Davidic king to come up, to show up to restore Israel. And part of what they're waiting for is, a new heaven, a new earth, but part of the restoration of Israel is to kick the Romans and all these other cultures out of their land so that they can be the rulers of their own home. And in theory, they're wanting to just worship the one true God without any, mix-ups, but this is all the things that they're waiting for. So when Jesus shows up and is not at all what they're expecting, naturally they get a little, what the heck?